When flames first shot up, it was a true excitement. It was a very dramatic moment.
This was an immense fire, and it was like a circus.
On December 10th, 1938, David O. Selznick burned down Atlanta.
He would be billowing smoke, fire, and flames, and then they'd say, cut, 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 and they'd turn off the gas, and they'd turn on the water, and people would applaud, and people would go up to David the Pope and say, how was that? Did you like that?
On the back lot of his Culver City studio, Selznick had begun filming what would be Hollywood's and his greatest triumph, Gone with the Wind. David Selznick was just 36 and already a legend. He ran his own studio, kept insane hours, was a beast to work for.
He had enormous strength, and he dominated every film. He was a giant. David Selznick was, I think, the greatest producer who ever lived.
In a town of mayors, Xanax, and Goldwins, Selznick was king. His film would be the greatest of the studio era, defining Hollywood for decades. But Selznick's lasting contribution would have nothing to do with his grand Southern epic. Instead, it would be a fat, quiet director who was the shining star of British cinema. For in the spring of 1939, David Selznick brought Alfred Hitchcock to America.
Hitchcock was a star. You know, the director in those days was somebody that was behind the camera, that did not impose himself on the film, did not want to star in his own film. But Hitchcock was the star of his film. It was a Hitchcock film.
Alfred Hitchcock was the most famous director outside of Hollywood, a genre all to himself. He was a shy, retiring filmmaker, never one to raise his voice, yet he commanded the attention of all England. He was their Griffith, their chaplain.
He was the absolute ruler. He looked after every detail on the set. Every single prop had to be okayed by him. I can't imagine anyone telling him what to do.
Alfred Hitchcock meticulously planned every shot, drawing it out, shooting only what he needed. It was a world apart from Selznick's uncontrolled, indecisive ways. But Hitchcock wanted to work in Hollywood, and in 1939, no one else would have him.
When you have these two men so different in personality and so different in the way they see things, you get a result that's good because you get two sticks rubbing together to make fire.
Alfred Hitchcock and David Selznick would struggle against each other for 7 years, each demanding more control than the other was willing to cede. From 1939 to 1946, they created some of Hollywood's greatest films, and one of its worst. But more importantly, their relationship would mark the passing of an era, a shift in the balance of power. For by the time Alfred Hitchcock left David Selznick, Selznick's career would be over. The studio system would be on the way out, and the director would be king. When David Selznick signed Alfred Hitchcock, he was without equal in Hollywood. At the peak of the studio system, Selznick had achieved something unimaginable: independence. But David always knew he was destined for greatness. He had ordained it when his father was driven to ruin. He was going to raise the Selznick name. He was going to redeem Pops. David Selznick was born in 1902, raised in New York City by a family that made movies. His father, Louis, was a Russian Jewish immigrant, a self-invented man that found his fortune in the moving pictures.
Louis was a wonderfully piratical figure. He was a gambler, he was a liar, he was a cheat, he was a fraud. And he got into moving pictures in the way that many people of that kind did.
David's world revolved around his father and the movies. After school, he would head down to the Selznick offices in Times Square. He edited the company newsreel, and along with his older brother Myron, attended financing meetings on Wall Street.
As a kid, he was carried along on the coattails of success. He didn't really go to school very much. He went down to the studio. He went to the cutting rooms. He gave his father advice on new talent. David, as a very young teenager, was looking at actresses on screen and off and writing reports on them to his father as to whether these people had career potential, whether he should take them on.
By 16, David dropped out of school. But who cared? From the time David was 12 until he was 21, Louis J. Selznick was one of the wealthiest men in America. The Selznick family moved to a lavish Park Avenue penthouse and bought a flock of Rolls Royces. Louis was a serious gambler and would host all-night poker games where the pots would sometimes reach $100,000. But David was on a strict allowance, $750 a week. His older brother Myron was getting $1,000.
These were not salaries, these were allowances given by a wealthy father to his two beloved sons. And everyone said, "You're making a mistake, Mr. Selznick." But he insisted on indulging these boys. And he always said, "Live beyond your means." And I think both of them eventually did.
They were encouraged to be young princes. And they were told, if you want it, go for it and get it. And if you can't get it by straight, legitimate means, bluff it, finagle it. I mean, those were family traditions.
In 1923, the bottom fell out of the Selznick empire. In the early 20s, the major studios started to emerge. Fox, Universal, MGM, Paramount, all sought control over the production and distribution of their pictures. Louis Selznick was not good enough, not adept enough to compete in this new world.
Well, when the bankruptcy took place, David became furious with the whole motion picture industry. And both of the boys went out to Hollywood to get even with the whole industry, you know. And they were both ambitious, and they were going to be ruthless in their demands, you know, and show them how to make films.
David Selznick landed in Hollywood in 1926 with nothing to his name. He talked, hustled, and cajoled his way into MGM, where he started at the bottom, a reader in the story department. After one day on the job, David started bombarding the front office with memos, telling them how to run their studio. It got him noticed, and soon he was trading ideas with Irving Thalberg and Louis B. Mayer. To David, that seemed right. In his mind, he knew more about making movies than any of the executives he worked for.
Selznick, I think more than any other producer or production executive in Hollywood, figured out how to put one foot in each camp as a studio executive or a production executive and as an active producer. And I think certainly more than Thalberg or Zanuck or Hal Wallace, This is someone who was very, very actively involved in the day-to-day making of movies.
David made a name for himself by producing films like What Price Hollywood, Dinner at 8, and Anna Karenina. He discovered Katharine Hepburn and was in charge at RKO when King Kong was made. But perhaps more importantly, David married into Hollywood's version of royalty.
Second daughter of Louis B. Mayer was probably the most intelligent young woman in Hollywood, maybe also the coldest. But she was a great talker. And I think there's no question but that their relationship, David and Irene's relationship, began in talk, in conversation. I think she may have been the first woman David had found he really loved talking to.
David and Irene Selznick were married in a private ceremony that made headlines in all the trades. But behind their backs, Hollywood gossiped. Irene's father was head of production at MGM, and in a town infatuated with power, speculation of David's motives ran high.
David married the daughter of one of the most powerful people in town, and you cannot rule out the careerist element in that. And I think for David and Irene, both of them, it was always a nagging thought. Many people made nasty jokes about it. Son-in-law also rises.
David hated to talk. He didn't need anyone. He had ideas and talent enough to rise to the top. Hollywood in the 1930s made films by committee. The moguls might run the studios, but they had teams of people making their pictures. Writers were hired in packs. Directors assigned to productions only days before they started. Overseeing it all were teams of junior execs who worked on dozens of films simultaneously.
You haven't proposed to me yet tonight.
David wanted one man in charge, one vision up there on the screen: the producers.
In the end, I think what he meant was, I want to be on my own. I want to be independent. I want to be my own boss. I don't want anyone telling me what to do. I want to tell other people what to do. Because emotionally, that was his prime need. He wanted to have his own studio.
He did finally, when we left MGM and opened our own studio, he had the name Selznick International Pictures. And the day we opened that studio was one of the happiest days of his life.
In 1935, with money he raised on Wall Street, David started Selznick International Pictures, the studio that in 4 years would bring Alfred Hitchcock to America. In the 1930s, Alfred Hitchcock was no less independent than David Selznick. In England, he was the unquestioned ruler of his movies. But Hitchcock's journey to this point could not have been more different than Selznick's. In fact, until he fell into movies, his life had been quite ordinary. Alfred Hitchcock was born at the turn of the century to a greengrocer's family in London's East End. He was overweight and shy. By his own account, he was a loner who lost himself in a world of his own making.
I think he was a boy with a very strong internal life and who entertained himself, who found interesting methods of entertaining himself. He was very interested in maps and map making and timetables.
Hitchcock read train schedules the way other kids read comics. He kept a record of every British ship at sea and memorized the streets of New York City. At home, his parents, William and Emma, were devout Catholics. Every night, young Alfred would stand at the foot of his mother's bed for what they called his evening confession. The discipline was left to his father.
Now, the problem with his father was that he saw being Catholic as being part of an endangered species. That translated into his being enormously stern rule maker. Just a powerful personality. Very stern and very strict.
As a child, Hitchcock could escape only as far as the local tram would take him. One Sunday, he miscalculated and found himself unable to get home. When he finally arrived, hours later, he found his father waiting for him at the door.
My father sent me with a note to the local chief of police, who glanced at the little piece of paper and then led me along a corridor, and I was locked in a cell for 5 minutes. Then he let me out and said, "That's what we do to naughty boys."
For the rest of his life, Alfred Hitchcock talked about the clang of that cell door, how its sound never left him. As he got older, Hitchcock found his refuge in the movies. He loved the cinema and would often go alone, sitting in the gallery by himself. He stopped reading train schedules and turned to trade journals. He read that an American company was opening a studio in London. He created a portfolio, walked in, and got a job designing title cards.
Well, I'm actually American trained. I got a job in the editorial department of the London. And they import London studio, and they imported everyone from Hollywood. When you went in that door, you might well just be in Hollywood, because everyone, cameramen, directors, actors and actresses, were all from Hollywood.
But within a few years, the Americans gave up on England. Hitchcock was left working on small British films until in 1924, he got the chance to go to the only place that rivaled Hollywood. When Alfred Hitchcock arrived in Berlin, it was one of the most exciting places in cinema. Masters like Murnau, Pabst, and Lang were experimenting, pushing the limits of film.
One of the things that he picked up was that the silent cinema meant that you tried to tell the story as much as possible in pictures rather than in words. And the fewer words you put on the screen to interrupt the flow of the images, the better off you were. Now, the greatest master of silent cinema in that regard was F.W. Murnau. And he watched F.W. Murnau shoot.
Berlin was also Hitchcock's first exposure to nightlife. He was 25, did not drink, did not smoke, and had never been out with anyone other than his sister. But he did have his eye on one girl. Alma Reville began her career as an editor when she was 16 and knew almost as much about the craft of making movies as Hitchcock.
Well, I think Alma Reville was about as important as anybody in Hitchcock's life and his career. She was his whole world. I mean, I think she was his first girlfriend, and I think Hitch was probably a shy guy and not that easy with the girls. He was always too heavy. And I think Alma was, was his savior in a way.
Alfred and Alma Hitchcock were married on a December morning in 1926. For the rest of his life, Alma was always at Hitchcock's side. She was his collaborator, his best friend, the one voice he trusted. Hitchcock always claimed that he never had any intention of becoming a director, that the idea never crossed his mind. The impetus, he said, came from his boss, Michael Balkan. True or not, Hitchcock blossomed once he got behind the camera. He had been schooled by the world's finest. He knew exactly what he wanted and how to get it.
We used to have drawings of every camera move. We used to have the sheets made up, sheets of blank paper, with 3 frames on each page, and he would then, in each frame, he would draw what he expected to see, and that was in every camera move.
He said the most boring thing about making a picture is shooting it. And when he once said that to me, I said, "No, what do you mean by that, Hitch?" And he said, "I've already done it. In my mind, the cuts, each shot has been laid out in my mind already."
No longer shy and diffident, Hitchcock found a way to connect to others through movies. He made a name for himself with a series of silent films, The Lodger being the most important. But it was with sound that Alfred Hitchcock became the unquestioned star of British cinema.
Blackmail was a silent film. Now, when we were about halfway through shooting the film, sound suddenly happened. The jazz singer, I think, was over here. Suddenly, everybody said, it's going to be sound. So movies are going to talk, pictures are going to talk.
They say you're wild and naughty child, Mr. Today.
The advent of sound meant a complete rethinking of how movies were made. Cameras suddenly were too noisy. Arc lights, which hissed loudly, were no longer practical. But on Blackmail, Hitchcock's real challenge came from his leading lady, Annie Andra.
Well, Annie Andra, naturally, with a Czech accent. She couldn't possibly continue, but too much had been photographed. So I got another young actress, whose name was Joan Barry, to sit on the side with her own mic. And Annie Andra, the Czech girl, just mouthed her words.
Graham, I've lost one of my gloves. I think I left it at the other table.
And somehow or other we managed. And I must say, through it all, this Hitchcock emerged as brilliant. I can only say he was brilliant. And he used sound in a way that I thought was brilliant.
Defense.
And Andrew, I get him nosy. Mind you.
As news of the murder spreads, she panics, afraid to tell anyone of her involvement.
I mean, it's one thing to buy chocolates out of ours, but it's quite another to stick a knife into a gentleman.
Leaning in the doorway, a rather intruding type of customer who talked about, have they heard about the murder around the corner?
But knives. No, knives is not right. I must say that's what I think and that's what I feel.
So as her voice went on, it became a drone. But the clearest word was knife all the time. And it was played over the girl's...
Knife?
Alice cut the bit of world was simply photographing pictures of people talking. Hitchcock was using sound cinematically, expanding the language of movies. In the press and parlors of London, Blackmail and its director were hailed as national treasures. Hitchcock was just 30 years old and England's preeminent filmmaker. Hollywood during the studio era did not place much value on the director. With few exceptions, they were considered interchangeable. Europe might celebrate Alfred Hitchcock, but in America, it was men like David O. Selznick who were considered great filmmakers.
In the 1930s, hardly any directors were thought of as auteurs. David's sense of directors were people he hired to do the things he didn't have time to do himself. Because David lived with this great dream that if he had only had time, he could have directed the film himself.
This was the hallmark of every Selznick production, but none more so than Gone with the Wind. From the moment he bought Margaret Mitchell's book, David Selznick was consumed by it. He obsessed over the script, the cast, the costumes, the makeup, the architecture, anything that would affect the look and feel of his film.
He was a very, very capable man, and he let everybody know that he was the boss. He was a very cruel boss, because he didn't hesitate to speak his piece.
Selznick commanded his troops through a steady stream of memos which detailed his every order. He could dictate for hours, and often did, aided by a constant supply of Benzedrine, which he carried in his pocket like loose change.
Once in a while, I'd say, give me one of those things to stay awake. And, you know, once in a while I would have one, and I would go in there and type all night long. When he'd see we're wearing down, you know, pushing too hard, he'd stop and jump in his car and go down to Saks and come back with a little present or something for us. And we'd say, well, he's not so bad after all.
He was a kind, good man, basically. It's just that in the stress of production, he became a different human being.
Everyone in David's orbit had their lives torn apart by his work habits, his inability to delegate. But it was his directors who suffered the most. George Cukor and David Selznick were old friends. Together they had made classics like Little Women and Dinner at 8. Cukor had been Selznick's first choice to direct Gone with the Wind. But once filming began, David was unhappy. The pacing was too slow, the film too flat. Selznick hovered over the set, demanding to approve every setup. But no matter how hard he pushed Cukor, David could see no improvement.
He was such an insidious, really a terrific, dynamic producer. And when George Cukor sent us these dailies that were so pallid and so nebbish that we couldn't accept it, David had to fire his best friend.
2.5 weeks into production, Selznick fired George Cukor and hired Victor Fleming. Fleming was under contract at MGM and in the middle of directing The Wizard of Oz. No matter, Louis B. Mayer pulled Fleming off the picture and loaned him out to his son-in-law. Fleming yelled, screamed, and fought with everyone but Clark Gable. Vivian Leigh hated him. Fleming, for his part, hated Leigh. Gable hated Selznick. Everyone hated Selznick. He was the most despised man in his studio.
Everybody was upset. It was an upset studio. And nobody liked anybody.
Selznick didn't seem to notice or care. He rode everyone, working his studio to exhaustion with 18-hour days. After 3 months, Victor Fleming collapsed, but neither Selznick nor his film missed a beat. David hired veteran director Sam Wood. When Fleming returned, David kept Wood on. Most days the actors found themselves being directed by Fleming in the morning and Wood in the afternoon. It didn't matter. For all the directors and their different sensibilities, the same man was always in charge. A year after Selznick sent Atlanta up in flames, Gone with the Wind had its premiere on Peachtree Street. It was a huge success.
Mr. David O. Selznick.
A defining moment for David and Hollywood.
3 years of effort have led to this moment. If Atlanta, which is the final judge, approved our efforts, these labors will not have been in vain.
It is the measure of accomplishment in the classical Hollywood era, no question about it. It accomplished everything that anyone could have possibly hoped, any individual picture could have accomplished. And, you know, Selznick was perhaps the only individual in the industry that could have pulled it off.
That year, Gone with the Wind won 8 Oscars, including Best Screenplay, Best Actress, and Best Direction. David took home 2 Oscars, Best Picture and the Irving Thalberg Award. Bob Hope called the ceremony a benefit for David Selznick. He was just 38.
The success was overwhelming. It was more than anyone had thought was possible. The biggest thing, though, that it did was to encourage him to think that his crazy method of working was the method of working. He was so lucky to have gotten away with it. David thought that it was proof that his way of changing his mind all the time, working everyone 18 hours a day, that was the way to proceed. It just convinced him that he could be as much of a megalomaniac as he was naturally.
I have the honor in presenting to you one of the most remarkable men in the world.
The 39 Steps, The Man Who Knew Too Much, The Lady Vanishes, all had been wildly popular in England. Each film followed a formula of suspense, romance, and humor, and together they solidified Hitchcock's image.
Keep your seat! Keep your seat, please!
But by the late 30s, the British film industry was in steep decline. Their studios lacked the technical expertise to compete with Hollywood. War with Germany loomed. But perhaps more importantly, filmmaking in England received little respect.
Filmmaking was not considered a profession to take very seriously, especially if you were British and doing it. And it bothered him. And he felt that in Hollywood, in America, where film was taken more seriously, so he believed he would get the respect that he felt he was entitled to.
And so with a series of modest films to his name, Alfred Hitchcock put out the word that he would like to make movies in Hollywood. But only one man responded, David Selznick.
I think Hitchcock wanted to go with Selznick because Selznick had a boutique operation, and Hitchcock felt that his pictures, he would be allowed to make pictures his way, and his pictures would be regarded as special.
When Hitchcock arrived in America, the first picture Selznick wanted him to direct was the Titanic. David wanted to buy the Leviathan, a relic from World War I, and sink it off the coast of Santa Monica. But the cost proved exorbitant. The idea was scrapped. Instead, Hitchcock's first American picture was based on a book he had read in England.
I suppose that's why you married me. Because you knew I was dull and gauche and inexperienced, and could never be any gossip about me.
Gossip? Rebecca was a Gothic story of love about an unnamed heroine who marries a remote British aristocrat named Maxine de Winter.
Maxine.
But their union is haunted by the mysterious death of de Winter's first wife, Rebecca. Hitchcock convinced Selznick to let him adapt the book. He downplayed its romance and refashioned Rebecca to his taste. This was the way Hitchcock liked to work. Find the essence of a story, its one good idea, and throw the rest away. It had brought him enormous success in England. But as method, it was a world apart from Selznick.
Hitchcock wanted to turn Rebecca into an action film, and he went about creating a treatment to that effect. And Selznick knew immediately that that was not what he wanted, and he responded with a memo that expressed his displeasure.
Selznick lashed into Hitchcock with a memo that went on for 3,000 words. He told him that his treatment was vulgar, cheap, and unsophisticated. That he had bought Rebecca and had every intention of making the book, not some botched-up semi-original. Hitchcock's work was pretty bad, David concluded, and it was easier to write a new treatment than repair this one.
What David said in that memo was heartfelt. David believed that if you were going to adapt a book, you should be faithful to the book. You should understand the book. You should say, what is this book about? What is the literary quality? What is the story? That's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to put on screen. And he was offended, I think, truly offended, by Hitchcock's being prepared to change the book and change the story because it would make a better film, maybe.
Here, have this. Put it over your head.
Thank you.
Selznick felt that he could see into the mind of his young female audience. They had identified very strongly with the second Mrs. de Winter.
That's it. That's Manderley.
Selznick was afraid that Hitchcock was going to lose the charm, the vulnerability of this character.
I didn't expect the whole staff to be in attendance.
Mr. Danvers' orders, sir.
Oh. Sorry about this. Won't take long.
What Selznick has done again and again is bring Hitchcock back to the roots of the character.
This is Mrs. Danvers.
What is the second Mrs. De Winter feeling now?
How do you do?
How do you do? I have everything in readiness for you.
It's very good of you. I didn't expect anything.
Show us the small gesture, the telling gesture that will get us inside this character.
I think we'd like some tea, Fred.
Ready in the library, sir.
Come along, darling.
Filming on Rebecca began 5 days after England declared war on Nazi Germany. For Hitchcock, who had left behind his mother and brother in London, it was a trying time, which only got worse as he discovered his place in Hollywood's hierarchy.
Well, Hitchcock was a very, very expressive man. But when Selznick came on the set, he shrank. He shrank immediately. And you could feel that he wasn't happy about it. And he'd say, oh, hello, David. Come on in. Yeah, we're doing so-and-so, this and this take. And Selznick would say something like, well, you know, Hitch, I didn't like the last one. And Hitchcock would shrivel. Just hated criticism, especially in the middle of a picture.
He expected royal treatment, and he didn't get it. He was treated as only the director of the film. And he got these awful memos from Selznick right from the beginning, condescending, telling him that he would have to shoot more footage than he had been shooting so that Selznick would have more footage to choose from in the editing room. Well, that was not Hitchcock's way.
Hitchcock would film fragments, very precise angles, just below the chin. The camera slightly tilted off so there was a little feeling of psychological unease to it, which will then cut to a shot from way up in the corner of the room, looking down on these little people. And he knew exactly the order and the timing of these shots in advance, and he only filmed exactly what he wanted.
And consequently, Selznick was very upset that he wasn't providing more footage. And he referred to Hitchcock's method of filmmaking as that damn jigsaw cutting. What he meant was that Hitchcock filmed the shots like pieces of a puzzle that all fit together, and they would fit together only one way, and that was Hitchcock's way.
And Selznick says, that's not the way I do things. So they fought. And the more they fought, the more interference there was.
Even with Selznick's constant tinkering, many scenes in Rebecca were distinctly Hitchcock's. He played with perspective and point of view in ways that were entirely his own. But for the most part, Hitchcock felt constrained, compromised by Selznick. Rebecca ends with De Winter's mansion being burned to the ground. It is a cathartic moment, one where Rebecca's long shadow over the film's lovers is finally consumed.
Look! The west wing!
Selznick wanted the smoke coming out of the smokestack at the end of Rebecca to form the letter R. He said, can you imagine? he would tell that to form the letter R. Can you imagine?
Hitchcock dismissed Selznick's idea out of hand. He felt that an embroidered pillow, devoured by the flames, was infinitely more tasteful. He won that fight, but felt battered by Selznick and resented the interference. For the rest of his life, he dismissed Rebecca, claimed it was not a Hitchcock picture.
But I think it was important that he had Selznick on his back for this first film. Without Selznick's badgering, he probably would not have been forced to assume the female point of view, to explore character, to explore narrative from one point of view as he did in Rebecca.
That year, Rebecca was nominated for 11 Academy Awards, including Best Director, Best Screenplay, and Best Picture. In a final insult, Hitchcock lost, and Selznick won. Nobody before or since had won the Academy Award for Best Picture 2 years in a row. It was a remarkable achievement. But David's life was starting to come undone. He was about to pay the price for his independence, just as Alfred Hitchcock was to make a play for his. In 1940, David Selznick had 3 films in release: Gone with the Wind, Rebecca, and Ingrid Bergman's first American picture, Intermezzo. Yet Selznick's profits were greater than every studio in town. Money was pouring in, and David spent it as fast as he could. He bought Irene fur coats, an 18-karat diamond. He commissioned plans for a new studio complex to be called Selznick City. He gambled. Anything but make movies.
He became impossible, unmanageable, and at the same time, because he had been such a striving person who had now had success, he became depressed. I think he suddenly wakes up. You know, he isn't yet 40, and he says, "What do I do? What do I do next?"
David became afraid of competing with himself. He stopped making movies, and instead packaged his projects, scripts, stars, directors, and then sold them to the highest bidder. Joan Fontaine went to Fox for Jane Eyre. Ingrid Bergman was loaned out for Gaslight and Casablanca. And Alfred Hitchcock was sold everywhere. On loan out, Hitchcock went back to what he knew best, suspense films. He also collaborated once more with Alma on Suspicion and Shadow of a Doubt. But Hitchcock did use his freedom to branch out. He made a screwball comedy with Carol Lombard, worked with Pulitzer Prize-winning author Thornton Wilder, and experimented in Lifeboat by having an entire picture confined to one set, all without the interference of Selznick.
Hitchcock is able to maintain his independence. He's able to go from project to project, studio to studio, learn the industry in increasingly more detailed fashion, and at the same time he's learning how to become a producer. Very heavily involved in pre-production and developing the script in all those films, often getting writing credit, and pretty heavily involved in editing as well. Things that wouldn't have happened if he'd have been working with Selznick.
Hitchcock was settling in, establishing himself in his new home. He socialized with Hollywood's elite and became a fixture at Chasen's restaurant, where he ate the same meal at the same booth every Thursday night. But for all his independence, Alfred Hitchcock was still under contract, still David Selznick's property.
Hitchcock benefits tremendously from being leased to other producers and studios, but he is under an exclusive contract to Selznick, so of course Selznick is selling his services for more than he's paying him, and as they said in the business in those days, pocketing the overage. And there's a great deal of resentment on Hitchcock's part.
Hitchcock complained bitterly. This was worse than having Selznick edit one of his movies. But David didn't care. For him, the deal became everything. Nothing else seemed to matter, except gambling. That he did as if he was trying to purge himself of success.
He would go over to his friend's house, either Goldwyn's or Manning's or someplace at night, and play gin rummy. He loved to play cards. And that's where he would lose money to these men. $3,000, $4,000 to this one, $5,000 would go to another one, maybe $10,000 to another one. Over the 2 or 3 years, it just went into the millions that he lost.
David Selznick had been taught to live beyond his means, to work as if he were destined for greatness. And for a while, he achieved remarkable things. But by the mid-40s, David's life was starting to unravel. His marriage to Irene was beginning to fail. His studio was suffering from neglect. His brother Myron was drinking himself to death. Myron Selznick had moved to Hollywood with David in the 1920s, and for a while he had been the premier agent in town. But Myron had fallen into agenting for its easy money and trappings of power. What he really wanted was to produce, like his brother and father before him. Instead, he brokered talent and drank.
David took Myron's death pretty hard, and he cried a lot for a long time. He would just break down and cry when he'd think about him.
And David's grief was so tangible that it scared me. I was walking with him at Myron's funeral, and tears were streaming from his eyes, mucus running from his nose. He was being held up by two people who couldn't walk. And it was a very, very tragic occasion.
David had been falling deeper into depression since the high had gone with the wind. He fled Hollywood, but the darkness followed. In New York, he became so sick he was unable to leave his hotel room. He told Irene he was going insane. Desperate, she sought help. At Irene's insistence, David started seeing May Rom. Rom was unerringly patient and more than a little taken by Hollywood glamour, and all the perfect therapist for David Selznick.
He loved psychoanalysis, he loved psychotherapy because it was like a story session, and he was the subject of the story. All that happened in these sessions was that he and a very fond and attentive woman would endlessly talk about his motivation and his character and his needs and his interests and his impulse. It was an egotist's dream.
Analysis helped David immensely. Within a few weeks, he was up and about again. Rom cautioned that therapy was a long, difficult process, but as David saw it, he was cured.
I don't think he was a serious or good patient in any way at all. And I think May Rom quickly came to feel that she was being used and exploited. But it was a way of making the narcissist come back to life.
Therapy hadn't done much for David's megalomania, but it did get him producing again. After his sessions with Rom, he had an idea for a film about the healing powers of not being loaned out. David would bring him back, have him make that film, even if it was an imperfect fit.
I hope you feel better today, Mary. Well, I don't. You will. I think this whole thing is ridiculous. What whole thing, Mary? Psychoanalysis. It bores the pants off me.
David Selznick had come up with the idea for Spellbound. And as the producer, he must have thought he still held unquestioned authority over his films.
Really? My patients invariably regard me as a wretched nuisance during our first talks.
I see. It's my subconscious putting up a fight.
But Alfred Hitchcock was no longer a novice at the politics of movie making. He was determined to make Spellbound his own.
Well, you know why you're doing something that's bad for you and when you first started doing it. So then you can begin curing yourself.
Hitchcock wanted very much to get control of this project and immediately found a vehicle that he felt would be more to his liking than something that Selznick might choose. And this was The House of Dr. Edwards. It was one of these lurid accounts of a madhouse. Very much not the thing, I think, that Selznick would on his own have found as the proper way of exploring psychoanalysis.
The House of Dr. Edwards was a story of witchcraft, satanic cults, psychopathology, and murder, set in a Swiss asylum. Hitchcock somehow convinced Selznick that he could rework the story into a thriller, where analysis solved the mystery. He attacked Edwards much the way he had Rebecca, filling it with his ideas. Among them a patient who believed he was growing old backwards and had now reached the age of 10. Selznick took one look at Hitchcock's treatment and hired his director, a collaborator, veteran screenwriter Ben Hecht.
Hecht was Selznick's stand-in. Hecht was the one who was going to keep Hitch on the straight and narrow and not let him veer off into gags and bits and individual scenes that had no coherence.
Who are you?
Selznick pushed Hitchcock and Hecht throughout the writing of Spellbound. He sent memos demanding more romance and added a conventional murder mystery to the story.
Edwards is dead. He killed him. Took his place. From someone else, I don't know who. I killed him.
David, however, wasn't content to write by proxy alone and called for all-night story sessions in his Hollywood home.
Time really didn't matter to him. He often slept in his clothes. He slept at the studio. And if he was ready to talk about a script at 2 in the morning, that was the time the script got talked about. Hitchcock, who had, as you know, an interest in train schedules, must have found this near abusive treatment.
If Hitchcock expected more autonomy on Spellbound than he had on Rebecca, Selznick had quickly broken him of that idea. David was still the producer, still running the show. He even made Hitchcock answer to his analyst.
He thrust Mayrom on Hitchcock. My take on Hitchcock was that he was a man who had instinctively a very acute sense of psychology, who did not need professional advice.
Selznick had treated Mayrom as an employee. Now, he made her one. She became the technical advisor for Spellbound and was given authority over the script, much to Hitchcock's dismay.
Mayrom was on the set, and I was there one day when she was objecting to something that Hitch did in a scene as a violation of psychoanalytic theory. And this brought forth one of Hitch's favorite remarks. He said, "It's only a movie, May. And in a movie, we don't have to stay absolutely faithful to what fact is."
Alfred Hitchcock could not have been mistaken as a good candidate for the analyst's couch. He was too guarded, too private to ever want to examine his own motivations. He didn't even like doing it with his actors. Gregory Peck was David Selznick's new contract player and had been cast in Spellbound against Hitchcock's wishes. Hitchcock thought Peck was too young, too inexperienced for the role. But even worse was the fact that Peck had been trained in method acting, where emotion determines motivation.
Well, for Hitchcock, motivation was your salary. Hitchcock was a great exponent of negative acting. Negative acting he defined as you have one expression in your face and you let it go to another expression. Well, for Gregory Peck in Spellbound, this is not very meaningful. He's looking for who this character is, and Hitchcock is not giving him very much other than walk here, stand here, look there, look there.
This is the essence of Hitchcock. Film as a visual medium, where even the actors are turned into props.
Is that you, Mr. Brown? I'm just having a glass of milk and some crackers. Join me, please.
Since his days as an apprentice in Germany, Hitchcock strove to tell his stories through images rather than words.
Milk by himself.
But psychoanalysis, the talking cure, didn't lend itself easily to this approach.
Hitchcock's way of dealing with it was to think in terms of how he could represent craziness and the dream state through visual means. And the specific place where that happens in the film is, of course, the Salvador Dali dream sequence. And it was Hitchcock's idea to bring in Salvador Dali to design a surreal dream sequence for Gregory Peck when he is telling his dream to Ingrid Bergman and her professor.
Leaning over the sloping roof of a high building, a man with a beard. I yelled at him to watch out. Then he went over, slowly, with his feet in the air. Then I saw the proprietor again, the man in the mask. He was hiding behind a tall chimney, and he had a small wheel in his hand.
It may be a way of countering the Mayram influence because Mayram, let's face it, as a psychoanalyst, is very comfortable with the verbal. What Hitchcock is trying to do is to convert what is essentially verbal into what is visual.
Mayram objected to Dali's work. She argued that his imagery was overly sexual and demanded that much of it be changed or simply deleted. Hitchcock fought hard to retain Dali's designs, but Selznick, seeking approval from the psychiatric community, listened to his analyst instead of his director.
And then a shadow chases him up and down a hill. That could mean he was escaping from a valley.
He used orthographical valleys like Sun Valley.
I think the narrative of the film is very much Selznick and Mayram trying to get psychoanalysis onto film. On the other hand, in the Dali sequence, you have Hitchcock trying to do the same thing, but do it in a visual means appropriate to film. And I think it produces a kind of schizophrenia, actually, within the film, and that the film doesn't really gel as a result, although it's a fascinating film.
Despite this, Spellbound proved an enormous commercial success, Hitchcock's biggest since Rebecca. It garnered 6 Oscar nominations, including Best Director.
Hitchcock is back in the news again, as he was not with Suspicion, as he was not with Lifeboat. It was very much to Hitchcock's advantage once more to be associated with Selznick.
Hitchcock, however, could only see the limitations. After Spellbound, he understood that if he was going to be the author of his own films, he was going to have to be their producer as well.
I'll keep the garden door open and I'll tell you if anything happens.
In the early 60s, years after the relationship was over, David Selznick took credit for Notorious. Notorious was entirely my conception, he wrote. I was responsible for the whole project. It was an absurd claim, but by then David was known for some of Notorious's glory. The idea for Notorious came from Hitchcock. After Spellbound, he had become enamored with Ingrid Bergman and wanted to make another film with her. He came up with a story about a woman who, as part of an elaborate confidence trip, is forced into sexual slavery. It was a disturbing idea, but not unusual for Hitchcock.
Hitchcock, in the years that he worked with Selznick, learned to make women's pictures, and by the time we get to Notorious, I think he's taken things, though, quite a ways from where Selznick might have imagined a woman's picture might go. I mean, this is a really dark film, and it's a film about an extremely, and particularly in the early drafts of the screenplay, a very unattractive female protagonist. You know, she's a prostitute, she's a drunk, and the film is very much about a process of redemption.
With Ben Hecht as his writing partner, Hitchcock fashioned a story of unrequited love, betrayal, and Nazi spies. But Selznick, who always fancied himself a writer, was not satisfied. The scripts were too dark, too depressing. He pushed Hitchcock and Hecht to open up their film, to conform to popular conventions.
At the end of the film, in one of the original screenplays, one or the other, depending on which screenplay you read, one of the other major characters has died, Cary Grant or Ingrid Bergman. Selznick takes a look at this and says, wait a minute, are you telling me that at the end of this great romantic thriller, I have one or the other of my romantic characters dead? I don't think so. And it's Selznick who brings Hecht and Hitchcock back to the need for a close that will bring these characters together alive.
In this way, Selznick fulfilled his role as a producer perfectly. But David's contributions in the writing of Notorious were limited by the scope of his personal problems. For years, his marriage to Irene had been in trouble. He worked too hard, gambled too much, and had been unfaithful almost since the day they were married.
I think that if you had said to him, "Look, you're cheating on your wife," he'd say, "Oh, that's, I'm a producer. They're actresses, or they're secretaries, or they're typists, or they're messenger girls, and that's expected of me. I've got to keep up appearances." It was a measure of the times. It was a measure of what power in Hollywood meant.
He made passes at me, but the first pass he made at me, I said, "What's this? Knock it off." And he said, "What are you doing, saving it for college?" And I said, "No, if I want it, I can get it. But just forget it. Forget it." And he looked at me, so laughed, and then he said, "Take a memo." And that was it.
I had very subtle ways of handling his personal life. I was involved in it, and I had to accept some responsibility. So after an evening out, I would forget to send the flowers. I would forget to send any kind of gift. So I stopped a great many of the affairs right in midstream because I loved Irene. I wanted to protect her. And after I left, I couldn't protect her anymore. And she was cast aside, Jennifer.
Jennifer Jones was different from David's other affairs. She was his creation. When they met, she was a struggling actress named Phyllis Walker. David put her under contract, remade her to his liking, and then fell in love.
I think there's no question that of all the actresses he had under his contract, Jennifer was the most pliant, the most passive, the most obedient. She did not fight him. I mean, Jennifer Jones is a name he chose for her, and she said, "Okay, Jennifer Jones."
For years, David had been lost, burdened by his success. Now, with Jennifer in his life, he was re-energized, convinced that through her, he could reclaim lost glory.
Jewel and Son was the first big, serious attempt to challenge his own past and his own reputation. He hoped it would be bigger and better.
In certain ways, it is a pretty spectacular film. It's visually not that interesting in terms of camera work, cutting, and so on and so forth, but it's a spectacular film to look at. There are sequences in the film that are quite stunning.
David's films always consumed huge amounts of money and manpower, but even they paled in comparison to the extravagance of Duel in the Sun. 150 men moved 20 tons of props, a two-story prefabricated house, a barn, and a windmill to the Arizona desert. 400 head of cattle were purchased. Hundreds of cacti were painted green so they would photograph properly, all at a cost of $15,000 a day. To direct this circus, David hired King Vidor, a veteran of over 40 films. He had signed on with the assurance that he would be left alone. But once filming began, Vidor was overwhelmed by an unrelenting stream of memos, detailing David's every displeasure.
He would sometimes come into the trailer and dictate. I'd type them up when I got back. Then I would take them and slip them under their door of their room. And when they wake up in the morning, there's a yellow memo on the floor.
By the fourth month of production, Duel in the Sun was 75 days behind schedule and hundreds of thousands of dollars over budget. David was hemorrhaging money. In desperate need for cash, he looked around for something to sell and came up with Notorious. In June 1945, Selznick sold Notorious to RKO for $800,000 plus 50% of the profits. Hitchcock got nothing, except his freedom. One of the conditions of the sale was that Selznick was barred from having any voice during the filming and editing of Notorious. That was given to Hitchcock, who for the first time in his career was his own producer.
I think it is to our collective good fortune that David is so monopolized by the problems of Jewel in the Sun and by his personal problems that he really lets Notorious go, and Notorious benefits, I think, enormously.
You'd better drink that.
The great fuss and furor of Jewel in the Sun was a shelter for Notorious.
Oh.
Notorious is a film that is loaded with visual experimentation, long takes with montage, camera movement, crane shots. There's just a lot going on in that film that's extremely distinctive.
Feel better?
He is constantly experimenting with, the nature and limits of literally cinematic expression.
There's a famous scene in Notorious when the camera's way up high during the party and slowly comes down into a close-up of the key in her hand. And I said, what was the purpose of that shot? And they had to build a special crane for that shot. You see the shots on the set, there was this big wooden construction to put that camera and have it come down like that. He said, well, that's just a visual way of saying, in this great party, there's one little tiny item that is the crux of the whole thing. And how else to say that but show it all and then just come right down to the key.
Hitchcock was crafting his film in ways Selznick could not conceive. The dark tones of his story, the sophisticated editing and camera work. But perhaps most telling was the way each man dealt with Hollywood's moral code. During the studio system, censors did not allow a screen kiss to be longer than a few seconds. Any more was considered lewd. Hitchcock understood how absurd this was. But unlike Selznick, he was not one to storm the gates. His way was more subtle, more passive.
It's nice out here. It's not bad for dinner. We can eat here. I'll cook it.
What he did is he stayed within the rules because he had them kiss intermittently. They would kiss and then pause and say something and then kiss again. And they did this for 3 minutes.
Mind if I had dinner with you tonight?
I'd be delighted.
They keep kissing. I mean, it's a prolonged kissing scene. It's actually the way people really kiss. And that's one of the things that makes it such a great and sexy scene. But it gets around the rule. And Hitchcock loved getting around rules. He'd been doing it with Selznick all the time.
I think the point about Hitchcock wanting to break the rules without seeming to was not just because he was a sly, crafty man.
You want me over right away?
I think it's because, given his background of having a very stern father, having a very stern Catholic education, he was afraid of breaking the rules. I think he felt it a moral imperative that he stay within the rules. But it stretched him as a filmmaker to create nuances and to suggest things indirectly in a way that was, I think, very creative.
On Duel in the Sun, David Selznick felt no such moral imperative. He pushed Vidor to make his film more explicit, more risque, regardless of the consequences.
I think David felt that he had discovered sex with Jennifer. I think Jewel in the Sun is a schoolboy's tribute to his own recently discovered sex life.
This is a very adolescent sensibility, I think, in terms of what he wants to do with Jones as well as the way he wants to control that project. It's a good measure of how far he's let his obsessions go.
By the 5th month of production, David had become totally unhinged. He complained that Jennifer Jones's hair wasn't messed up properly, that Joseph Cotton's boots didn't have enough dust on them, that Gregory Peck's hat was too far down on his head. King Vidor caught the brunt of his fury.
In the end, Vidor really can't take the interference, throws up his hands, and effectively, I think, says, look, David, you do it. You're trying to do it anyway. You're not letting me do it the way I want to do it. I'm not going to hang around.
Now, King Vidor told me that he just had one too many memos from when he couldn't take it anymore. He walked off. You know, the director doesn't walk off the set very often.
5 days after Vidor quit, Irene left David. In the gossips, David took responsibility for the breakup of his marriage. I'm difficult, he said. Irene has taken a lot of my temperament. That night, seeking solace, David went to Sam Goldwyn's house where he lost $32,000 at gin rummy. For the rest of 1945, he gambled away $300,000. The following year, he lost twice that much. Duel in the Sun, meanwhile, was still unfinished. David's first cut was 26 hours long. With the help of Benzedrine and a team of editors, he brought it down to 4, but it previewed horribly. David raged about how much work the film needed, that he was going to remake the whole damn thing from scratch. Then he collapsed. I know my trouble, he said. When I die, the obituaries will begin, David O. Selznick, producer of Gone with the Wind, died today, and I'm trying like hell to rewrite them.
I think Duel in the Sun was an attempt to top Gone with the Wind, to go further. I mean, it's a fairly human characteristic. If you succeed, you know, try to succeed even more so. It's a dangerous thing in Hollywood, trying to top yourself. And I guess that was what infected Selznick.
When Duel in the Sun was released, it almost was condemned, and the whole scenes had to be removed to appease the production code. The critics hated it. They dubbed it Lust in the Dust, and singled Selznick out for their scorn. Hitchcock, however, had created a masterpiece. With Notorious, he had shown Hollywood that he could thrive as his own producer. But before he could strike out on his own, he had to fulfill his contract. He had to make one more picture under David Selznick.
On the Paradine case, I think that David Selznick had gotten to the point where he trusted no one to bring him back to the pinnacle that was Gone with the Wind and Rebecca. And if someone was going to do it, it would have to be David Selznick himself.
Call Andre Latour.
Andre Latour.
Selznick had first thought of making the Paradine case when he was an up-and-coming producer at MGM in the early 30s. It was a story of an English barrister who, despite a successful career and marriage, falls disastrously in love with a woman accused of murder. David envisioned great courtroom drama and indiscreet romance. He gave the story to Hitchcock and, uncharacteristically, let him do with it what he wanted.
With Paradine, we've got a complicated dynamic. Hitchcock's long-term contract is almost up. Selznick's certainly aware of it. He's doing everything he can to maintain some kind of relationship and hopefully to sign him to a more limited contract, if nothing else. You've got Selznick demonstrating to Hitchcock that he will let him have a little bit more resources, more of everything.
After months of work, Hitchcock delivered his treatment. It reflected an almost total lack of interest in the project. There was no trial sequence, no courtroom drama, none of the pained romance that Selznick expected. David felt betrayed by Hitchcock's treatment. He turned to Ben Hecht for help, but was rebuffed. And so at the worst time possible, David Selznick decided to become his own screenwriter.
With parodying, the scripting goes on well into production, and that's one of the problems. David Selznick is sending new pages to the floor, is writing new pages and distributing them to the actors the day before, sometimes the morning before shooting.
As page after page of Selznick rewrite arrived on the set, Hitchcock would retreat to his bungalow while the actors memorized new lines. When they did get around to shooting, Hitchcock was so bored he would sleep, or at least pretend to, during takes.
It was a nightmare. It's a fairly simple story. Simple sets. It cost an unearthly amount because it just went on, and it was out of control. It was David at his very worst.
Taking inflation into account, The Parodying Case is the most expensive film of Alfred Hitchcock's career. He hated it, and as soon as he had assembled a rough cut, he walked away, officially ending his working relationship with David Selznick. When The Parodying Case was released, the critics were scathing. Slick and garrulous, wrote one. Scant lack of artistry, another. But the dagger to David's heart must have come from the New York Herald Tribune. There is too much David O. Selznick, it wrote, but the Hitchcock touch is still there.
By the time we get to the end of the 7-year relationship between these two men, I think we see Selznick as someone who has, since 1939, come almost completely undone. He will not make another important film, and only make a couple more films in his career. And this is a guy who's still in his mid-40s. I mean, this is quite remarkable. He's younger than Hitchcock. And on the other hand, I think we see Hitchcock as someone who has come into his own in Hollywood. And he is someone who sees accurately that the best years of his filmmaking career are still ahead of him.
For a while, Alfred Hitchcock struggled. His first films after Selznick, Rope and Under Capricorn, were disappointments. For years, he went without a hit. But unlike Selznick, Hitchcock had the stability of his marriage to ground him. Alma remained the center of his world, and it was her approval that always mattered most. It was, for the most part, a quiet life, where the drama was confined to his films. Rear Window, made in 1954, announced the reemergence of Alfred Hitchcock. In it, he examined his own voyeuristic tendencies. Who believes his neighbor, Raymond Burr, has murdered his wife. Burr, with his white hair, thick frames, and constant chain smoking, looked suspiciously like David Selznick, perhaps Hitchcock's final rebuke of his one-time employer. Throughout the 50s, Alfred Hitchcock's work was met with critical and popular acclaim. To Catch a Thief, Vertigo, North by Northwest, all traded on themes that were unmistakably Hitchcock, and all were hits. But Hitchcock's greatest impact came in 1960 with Psycho, a film that had no major stars, a leading lady that was murdered in the first 30 minutes, and violence that meant to shock. It was a huge hit, tapping into the new youth market for the first time. Like Gone with the Wind 20 years earlier, Psycho defined a generation of moviegoing. The intervening years weren't so kind to David Selznick. After the failure of The Parodying Case, David made Portrait of Jenny, an even bigger disaster. The following year, he married Jennifer Jones and turned to Europe to make his movies. By then, Irene had moved to New York and had made a new life for herself. In 1947, the same year The Parodying Case was released, she produced A Streetcar Named Desire on Broadway. It was raw, modern, everything that David's work lacked. David was gracious in his praise, but Irene's success had shown how out of touch David had become, how much he had lost.
I think David in his last years, his last 15 years, say, went through very bad times and great disappointment. But he never let the world see that he was down, because he had been taught by his father to believe in appearances.
David never stopped trying to make movies. He couldn't. They were too much in his blood. But Hollywood had passed him by. The new stars were the directors. They were now considered auteurs, the ones receiving the recognition. In 1965, the Screen Producers Guild held a banquet in Alfred Hitchcock's honor. One of the hosts that night was David Selznick. He and Hitchcock had stayed in contact, even become friendly. But when David stood up to make his toast, he launched into an attack on Hollywood. He rambled. For many in the audience, he looked tired, worn out. 3 months later, David Selznick suffered a fatal heart attack. Newspapers across the country remembered him as he always feared they would, the producer of Gone with the Wind.
I see him as sad and tragic, never having achieved his ambition, which was to top Gone with the Wind. And you don't top a masterpiece like that. He never made a film that even touched it.
In 1951, David Selznick walked these streets with his old friend, Ben Hecht. Hollywood was in turmoil. The era of the contract player was all but gone. The studios had been forced to sell their theaters. Television was on the horizon. Selznick turned to Hecht and told him that the movies were over, that Hollywood was making foolish efforts to seem alive. Hollywood is like Egypt, David said, full of crumbled pyramids. It'll never come back. It'll just keep on crumbling until the wind blows the last studio prop across the sands. He was wrong, of course. Hollywood survived. It was David O. Selznick's Hollywood that didn't.